and reading it together. I would let's read from verse 19 onwards. So, there we go. From Acts 14. Here is the word of the Lord. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. That's the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Friends, let me start by asking you this question. What's the difference between an opinion and a conviction? Now, I don't want you to answer me because it's not a discussion forum, obviously. This thing doesn't work, so please help me with the clicker at the back. Thank you. An opinion is what you hold. A conviction is what holds you. An opinion is a belief that you keep as long as it's convenient for you. But a conviction is a belief that you keep even though it's no longer convenient. Even though it costs you something, you still hold on to that. That's what we see in the Apostle Paul's experience in the city of Lystra. A crowd had cheered and celebrated him, but days later, the same crowd was trying to kill him. Now, this scene that we're going to look at forces a question on us. Here is the question that I want you to think about this morning. Is the gospel of Christ merely an opinion? An opinion that you hold because it's convenient? Or is it a conviction in your heart? In other words, would you still stand on that, on the gospel, even if it costs you everything? So let's reflect on that question as we go through today's passage, guided by these three questions. Who do you really worship, rather? Are you willing to suffer for it? And is the gospel worth our suffering? So let's look at the first one. Who do you really worship? Now, we did not read these verses, but I'll do it later. We are in Acts 14. Let me set the scene first for us. And we have followed Paul and Barnabas in this 2-week mini-series on the missional church. And we've been following these two servants of God on their very first missionary journey that the church ever sent out in history. Now let me zoom out a bit because I think it will help you place yourself in the story. So Acts chapter 1 to 7, that's when the church was planted in Jerusalem. And then Acts 8 to 12 is when the persecution started. It scattered the church into Judea and Samaria. That's my sermon last Sunday. And then from Acts 13 onward, the church was sent out deliberately, on purpose, to the ends of the earth. And that's where we find ourselves this morning in Acts 14. Paul and Barnabas had been kicked out of Antioch, run out of Iconium, those two cities, and now they have landed in Lystra. Well, not landed because they fly, but they actually walk and they arrive in Lystra, in small, rough town in what is today central Turkey. Now, Lystra had no synagogue, right? There's no place of worship for the Jews. no evidence, in fact, of a Jewish community at all in Lystra at the time. So what did Paul do? He went to the marketplace. He went to the Agora. Imagine QV Market today on Elizabeth Street, right? He went there where people gather, where people talk and chat and have coffee and discuss their daily life. So let me read this for you. Now at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. Now notice that Paul was speaking. These are ordinary conversation, daily chit-chat basically. He was telling people about Jesus in that town square, in that piazza, in that marketplace. The same way you would tell a friend something important over coffee, right? But then something happens. In that crowd, as we read before, there was a man who cannot walk. He was lame from birth, never once taken a step, but he was listening intently. And Paul also looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well. And then Paul said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. So God enabled Paul to have this perception that this man had faith to be healed, right? And then a miracle occurred. But note this. Paul and Barnabas did not go into Lystra hoping to do a miracle. They want to share the gospel. And sometimes, not always, a miracle happened. So the healing was not the point. But the point is, God used this one man who was physically paralyzed to transform the entire city who was spiritually paralyzed. Now Lystra was filled with idol worship. So that lame man that was healed, he was exhibit A, showing that the living God is more powerful than all these idols. How do we know this? Look at verse 11. When the crowd saw that what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of man." Now that's completely a strange language that Paul did not understand. Paul spoke a few languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and perhaps other languages, but not these Lycaonian languages. It might as well they spoke in Klingon, right? Paul did not understand that. But what he realized, Barnabas, they called Zeus, and Paul, Hermes. Because he was the chief speaker of Zeus, right? And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands. You know what garland is? Garland is like a decorative wreath made of flowers and leaves. Basically what you do when you want to sacrifice something to the gods, little g. So they brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds for Paul and Barnabas. Why do they do that? Now, commentators of this passage explain why they did that. There was a local legend in that region, what we call urban myth today. It goes something like this. Zeus and Hermes once visited Lystra, but they were disguised as ordinary travelers, and only one elderly couple in Lystra had showed them hospitality. Everyone else turned them away, so the gods wiped out the whole population except that couple. So this town of Lystra had grew up on that story. The people were terrified of missing a god in disguise. So when they saw a paralyzed man being healed, jumping to his feet, they did not think a miracle. They think, this is happening again. This must be Zeus and Hermes came to us again in disguise. We're not blowing this a second time. So that's why Barnabas and Paul, they wanted to worship them as the gods, right? Now I want you to see clearly what's actually happening underneath this confusion, because this is not just a quirky misunderstanding in the ancient world, but this shows the human heart. When the human heart sees power, it grabs that and trying to worship that power. See, friends, if you don't worship the true God, you don't end up worshiping nothing. You end up worshiping Zeus, you end up worshiping your career, you end up worshiping your relationship, you end up worshiping your own reflection. You have to worship something. And notice what worship always drags behind it. Sacrifice. They always have to bring sacrifice. In this case, oxen and garlands, because something had to be given to appease, to please, to keep the God that you worship satisfied. That's human heart. That's human instinct. I have to hand something over to keep my God happy. Now everybody worships something. Actually, all of us at this very moment is worshiping something right now. You don't get a choice whether you worship. You only get a choice about who you worship, what you worship. Whatever you are currently living for, you're not free. You have been mastered by the thing that you seek, by the thing that you worship. It can be career, money, sex, your kids' achievements, your own body that you worship, your reputation that you worship. You chase any of these hard enough and they will run your life. They will control you. Because they promise more than what they can deliver. And they take more than you ever agreed to give. That's what idols do. That's what idols have always done. So Paul and Barnabas, they were shocked, right, when they saw what these people tried to do, worshiping them. They tore their garments. They rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Man!" It's not like today we're saying, "Man, what are you doing?" No, that's not what they said. But it's, "Man, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." So their reaction was immediate and physical. They tore their clothes, and in that culture, that means they were shocked because they were worshipped by these people. They did not pause and enjoy it. Okay, it's not like Barnabas said to Paul, "Paul, before you said anything, let us enjoy this moment. They're worshiping us. Let's just spend like 3 minutes enjoying all this adoration that people give to us." That's not what they did. They said, "Stop doing whatever thinking you're doing. We are just mortals like you. Don't worship us." And then they told them the good news. Turn from worthless idols, these vain things, to a living God. A living God who made heaven and earth, the sea, and everything in them. So basically they're saying, you're enslaved to something that is completely empty. So get a new master. And that's not all. Look at his next argument. In verse 16, he said, "In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. Yet, even though these nations betray God, God did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Paul is saying, your idols, they always want you to sacrifice something, because idols operate on exchange. You give your idol the sacrifice, and perhaps the idol will give you something in return. It's a transaction. But you got to sacrifice first, and then the idols may or may not do something in return. But that's not what the living God does. He still gives you rain and sunshine and food on the table, even though you ignore the living God. Now, friends, we are modern people living in the 21st century. We don't worship Zeus or Hermes or whoever your idols or your parents and great-grandparents' idols, because that's too primitive for us. But we still worship idols anyway, but different forms of idols. Your career can be an idol. The career that you're climbing only pays out if you keep performing for that idol. You miss a deadline, you miss a KPI, and it stops smiling at you. And as I said before, your relationship can be an idol. The relationship on which you build your identity, which only feels stable while it's going well. If the relationship goes down, there's a strain in that relationship, then you're not going to be happy because of that. Even your health, your looks, your reputation, every one of those is a transactional little God, quietly asking for sacrifice in exchange for a good feeling about yourself. It will take your sacrifice, but it may not love you back. That's what idols do. So friends, the questions underneath everything so far, let me ask you this morning. Who do you worship? Anyone you worship that is not God is an idol. It will deplete you. It will disappoint you. But the story is not finished there, because the very next scene puts a much harder question for us on the table. Here's the next question. Are you willing to suffer? Are you willing to suffer for the gospel? Because it's one thing to worship the true God when the crowd is adoring you, but it's another thing to keep worshiping God when the crowd starting to pick up the stones and throws them at you. So that's what happened to Paul. Suddenly there was these Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, having persuaded the crowd. Look at how they provoked the crowds. They stoned Paul. Now, when I was a new Christian, I read this passage kind of in a hurry, right? And I said, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. Okay, and then move on to my next activity, right? But I want you now to actually slow down a bit, actually to camp at this verse, and then think through what it actually means. When it says some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, you know, those two towns were roughly 170 kilometers away from Lystra. That's the distance between here and Shepparton. I don't know if you know Shepparton or Traralgon, right? Except that they are walking. What does it mean? These men did not happen to be in the neighborhood. They traveled, they walked deliberately a long way for one purpose: to stop Paul and Barnabas for good. Now, this is a set, consistent pattern throughout history. People who hate the gospel will often travel far, work so hard to destroy the gospel. Whilst people who said they love the gospel, they do very little about defending the gospel, speaking the gospel, sharing the gospel. So these men were persuading the crowds, and we were told what happens next. They stoned Paul, dragging him out of the city, assuming that he's dead. So look at the contrast. In verse 13, the crowd brought oxen and garlands to worship Paul and Barnabas, and now in verse 19, the same crowd were throwing rocks to kill them. That's how fast public approvals turns. It's the same instability you see in the crowd that shouts, Hosanna in Palm Sunday, and then crucify him 5 days later. You know the danger of building your life, your identity based on public applause. If your security, if your identity is built on people approval, you are one bad news cycle away from losing everything. Because the crowd that lifts you up today can put you down tomorrow. So I want us to camp here a bit and notice four things. Number one, this was not a hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration. Do you know the word hyperbole? It's like saying to your stubborn teenager, I've told you 1,000,000 times. That's a hyperbole, right? Because you never actually told your child 1,000,000 times. Probably it's just 17,567 times, but not 1,000,000. That's a hyperbole. You see, it's tempting to hear they stone Paul, and we think, this is the kind that Christopher Nolan did, right? Dramatic style in the Bible. These are things that are choreographed by a stunt man. No, that's not the case. Stoning was actually a common method back in the day, a method that was so reliable to kill someone. And you read before, they thought Paul was dead. That's why they dragged him out of the city. This wasn't a hyperbole. This wasn't an exaggeration. And we know this from two sources. Because Jesus himself, when Paul encountered Jesus for the first time in Acts 9, it says this, I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. Acts 9:16. And secondly, Paul himself listed his long catalog of suffering in grim detail in 2 Corinthians 11. Let me read you that catalog. Imprisonments, countless beatings, often near death. 5 times I received 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. And 3 times I was shipwrecked. It's quite probable that one time he was being stoned, it's this Lystra experience. So here's what I want you to understand. If you're tempted to think that gospel ministry is easy, the text will not let you have that thought. Gospel ministry has never been without risks. Because ministry that costs nothing accomplishes nothing. Ministry that costs nothing accomplishes nothing. That's the first one. The second thing that we notice, and this is something that I think is worth sitting on because even though Luke did not spell it for us, but I kept imagining, thinking, considering this. You know, when the first stone hit Paul's body, I imagine he experienced a huge pain. But he might suddenly remember something else. Years earlier, Paul, which was called Saul back then, before he knew Christ, Saul approved an angry mob to carry out a death sentence by stoning on a man called Stephen. Now, I did preach on that last Sunday. Stephen was the first Christian martyr. He was stoned to death. And Stephen's last act, as the stones came down on him, was to fall to his knees and pray that God would not hold this sin against the man who killed him, against Saul. Now, Paul is on the other side of the fence. He was the one on the ground being stoned to death. And I've been reflecting this for a long time. And the more I do, the more I'm convinced this is the reason why Paul could take the stoning, that one by one, the stone that came on to his body, because he had watched Stephen. He had watched Stephen suffer and died because Jesus was so worth it to him, and that sin never left him. See, Paul wasn't suffering because suffering is noble. He was suffering because he had come to believe, watching Stephen, that Jesus was very valuable. Valuable enough to die for. Valuable enough to be stoned for. I think that's what he remembered. The next one, he went back to Lystra. Now, this is a mind-blowing thing. Verse 20 may be the single most understated sentence in the whole book of Acts. Look at that. When the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city. Read that again slowly. He rose up and entered the city. He did not run. He did not head for the next town to recover somewhere safer. If I were Paul, the minute I realized, actually, I'm not dead, I would run as fast as possible, as far as possible from Lystra, and I would never go back to that town, ever. Because the people were mean, they were evil. I'll get out of this place as fast as I can. Not Paul. He rose up, he went back to that very place where he was stoned. Now, that's not stupidity. You might think this guy is stupid. That's not recklessness. That's what it looks like when your view of ministry, when your conviction on the gospel has already been settled by something other than your circumstances. Now, here's the principle. Paul did not let pain and suffering stop his ministry. Paul did not let how he was treated in Lystra determine his decision to continue in his ministry. What determines his stamina is the strength from God, the will of God. Unless God wants me to stop, I will continue preaching, sharing the gospel. Friends, what a remarkable example. And finally, again, another mind-blowing fact about what has happened. This is something that nobody in that scene could have known. But here's the fact. Lystra is actually the hometown of the young Timothy, Paul's protege. Somewhere in that crowd, or in the stories that spread through the town afterwards, there was a young man who was watching everything that unfolded. Watching Paul get stoned for the gospel. And this young man watching him walk back into the city straight away to keep preaching the gospel. And 2 chapters later in Acts 16, when Paul came back through his second missionary journey, he found this young man. And he took Timothy with him. And he prepared him to be the next generation of gospel servants. See, it's not hard to draw the line here. Do you see the pattern? Stephen's suffering birthed Paul's calling. Now, Paul's suffering gave birth to Timothy's calling. 3 generations. Ministry that never involves suffering will not produce that kind of fruit. You cannot manufacture a Timothy without someone first willing to suffer in front of him. It's amazing, isn't it? The story of the church. Stephen, Paul, Timothy. Now at this point, you might wonder, these 2 questions, who do you worship and are you willing to suffer? They sound like 2 separate sermons, but they're not. They are actually one argument. And let me land the plane for you in the remaining time that we have. Point 3, is the gospel then worth our suffering? Friends, every worldview has to answer for suffering somehow. Because none of us gets out of this life without suffering. And if you look at the traditional culture and the modern culture, they give you different answers. Traditional culture treats suffering as the price of honor. And do it well, you become a person of dignity. Right? If you're religious, they would say, treat suffering simply as the nature of this life. And the goal of your life is to rise above suffering, to detach from suffering. That's Buddhism. But modern culture has its own answer, and maybe the thinnest one of all. Modern culture said the meaning of life is the freedom to build a life that is free from suffering, that will make you happy. So suffering cannot be part of your life story because it's not meaningful. It's a malfunction, actually. It's a meltdown, something that you have to medicate over, something that therapy can help you so that you do not suffer. The gospel is entirely different. The gospel said you're not going to be immune from suffering when you become a Christian because we live in a fallen world. You will still experience suffering as a Christian, but when you suffer as a Christian, you become like Christ. How come? How can you become like Christ, more like Him, when you suffer for the gospel? Here is the answer. Remember when the people in Lystra wrongly said about Paul and Barnabas in verse 11? What did they say? They said this. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of man. See, they thought the false gods came down to them in disguise in the form of two men, Paul and Barnabas. But what if? What if the one true God came down to us in the likeness of man? You know, unbeknownst to them, they actually pointed out what has actually happened in history. That the true God, the living God, actually came down in the likeness of man in Christ Jesus. Listen to what Philippians 2 wrote about this. Though He was in the form of God, made Himself nothing, taking a form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, and being found in a human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Jesus, who's God, came down. He did not just visit like Zeus and Hermes. He was despised and rejected. He was dragged outside the city, not only almost dead, not left for dead like Paul, but he was actually dead. He was buried, actually. He was dead to bear the punishment of your idol worship, of your sin, of my sin. And on the third day, He got up, not to walk back into the city the way Paul did, but to walk out of the grave entirely so that everyone who trusts Jesus gets to walk in behind Him. Paul knew that. Paul believed that. And that is even after being stoned and left for dead, he can get up and go back to the same gospel ministry. Not because Paul was so brave, but because he belongs to someone whose hands and feet were nailed to a cross and beat that cross, defeated death. Friends, let me summarize. The gods of Lystra, they promise power without cost. You show up, you bring the sacrifice, you get the blessing. Every idol in your life is still selling that same deal, and it's a lie. It will take more than it gives, and it will not survive the first hot season in your life. But the true God, the living God, the one who actually came down in Jesus, instead of asking you to sacrifice for Him first, He became the sacrifice. He took the punishment that you deserve. He died on the cross, and then He was raised, not to walk back into the city, but to walk out of the grave. If you get Jesus, He will satisfy you completely. If you fail Jesus, He will forgive you completely. And if you follow Him, at some point, it will cost you. Maybe you're not going to be stoned because you are living in Melbourne, but maybe your friendship, your reputation, your comfortable future is something that you will have to sacrifice. The question of Lystra is not whether following Jesus is safe, because it never was. The question is whether you are actually found in Him someone worth it, someone who is worth your suffering. Would you come to Him this morning?